An angry crowd stood ready to execute a woman, but one sentence from Jesus turned every accuser into the accused. A terrified woman was dragged into the temple courts and thrown before Jesus. Religious leaders demanded a verdict. The law seemed clear. The crowd expected an execution. But what looked like a trial was actually a trap designed to force Jesus into an impossible choice. Most people remember this story as a lesson about forgiveness, but hidden inside it is a powerful lesson about hypocrisy, justice, mercy, and the human tendency to focus on other people's failures while ignoring our own. An execution seemed only moments away. Early one morning, Jesus was teaching in the temple courts. As usual, a crowd gathered around him. Some came to learn, others came out of curiosity. Stories about his miracles and teachings had spread throughout the region, drawing people wherever he went. But not everyone came with good intentions. For months, tensions between Jesus and many religious leaders had been growing. Every public challenge seemed to strengthen his influence instead of weakening it. To his followers, that proved he spoke with authority. To his opponents, it made him dangerous. Then the lesson was interrupted. A group of religious leaders pushed through the crowd. Between them stood a woman, terrified, humiliated, unable to escape. They forced her into the center of the gathering and made a public accusation. "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery." The atmosphere changed instantly. Everyone knew what such a charge could mean. This wasn't a debate. This was a matter of life and death. The crowd turned toward Jesus and waited for his response. But the woman wasn't the real target. Jesus was. The religious leaders believed they had finally cornered him. At first glance, the situation seemed simple. A woman stood accused of adultery. The law addressed adultery. The leaders wanted a verdict. But the situation was far more complicated than it appeared. If Jesus defended the woman, they could accuse him of disregarding the law. If he approved her punishment, they could accuse him of contradicting his own teachings about mercy and forgiveness. Either answer seemed dangerous. The trap was carefully designed. The crowd likely saw only two options: condemn her or defend her. But Jesus had a habit of exposing the deeper issue hiding beneath a question, and there was a major problem hiding inside this one. A detail that reveals what the leaders were really trying to accomplish. Someone was missing from the courtyard, someone who should have been standing beside the woman. According to the law, adultery involves two people, yet only one person stood before the crowd. Only one person faced public humiliation. Only one person faced possible death, the woman. If justice was truly the goal, where was the other person involved? His absence exposes the deeper problem. This was never primarily about justice. The woman had become a tool in a larger scheme, a human being reduced to leverage, a weapon aimed at Jesus. Whatever mistakes she had made, she was being used. The crowd may not have noticed, but Jesus did. He saw the fear in the woman's eyes. He saw the hypocrisy behind the accusation. And instead of giving the immediate answer everyone expected, he did something completely unexpected. He bent down and began writing on the ground, and suddenly the entire courtyard fell silent. The leaders demanded an answer. Jesus gave them silence. People began wondering what he was writing. Names? Scripture? Sins? The gospel never tells us. For centuries, readers have debated the answer, but the power of the moment wasn't in what Jesus wrote, it was in what his silence accomplished. The leaders wanted a quick decision. They wanted pressure, momentum, a public response before anyone had time to think. Instead, Jesus slowed everything down. The longer the silence lasted, the more the crowd was forced to reflect on what was happening. The leaders grew impatient. They continued pressing him, demanding an answer, demanding a verdict. Finally, Jesus stood up. The courtyard became still. Everyone leaned in. Then, he spoke a single sentence that changed everything. "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her." Then he bent down and continued writing. Notice what he did not say. He did not declare the woman innocent. He did not deny that adultery was wrong. Instead, he turned the focus away from the accused and toward the accusers. Moments earlier, every eye had been fixed on the woman's failure. Now, Each person was forced to consider their own. The crowd had come ready to judge. Jesus challenged them to examine themselves first. That was the brilliance of his response. He refused to ignore sin, but he also exposed the hypocrisy of those eager to condemn someone else while overlooking their own need for mercy. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether the woman had sinned. The question was whether anyone present was qualified to stand in judgment over her. Then, one by one, the stones began to fall. The crowd arrived expecting an execution. Instead, they found themselves on trial. For a moment, nobody moved. The courtyard remained silent. The woman stood frozen. The religious leaders waited. Then it happened. One person turned and walked away, then another, then another. John notes that the oldest left first, then the younger ones followed. The text doesn't explain why, but perhaps the older members of the crowd understood something experience often teaches. The longer people live, the more aware they become of their own failures, their own regrets, their own need for mercy. Jesus had forced every person holding a stone to confront a simple reality. None of them were innocent. The question was no longer about the woman's sin. It was about their own hearts. No arguments followed. No one challenged Jesus. No one stepped forward. Instead, the crowd quietly disappeared. The trap had collapsed. Soon the voices were gone. The accusations were gone. Only scattered stones remained on the ground, and when the dust settled, only two people were left standing, Jesus and the woman. Jesus looked around and asked a simple question. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She looked around and answered, "No one, Lord." Then Jesus spoke the words that have echoed through history. "Neither do I condemn you." Notice the balance in his response. Jesus did not excuse what happened. He did not pretend right and wrong no longer mattered, but he also refused to define the woman by her worst moment. Instead, he offered something she never expected: mercy. Then came the final instruction: "Go and sin no more." Those words complete the picture. Jesus offered forgiveness, but he also called her toward a different future. This was not permission to continue as before. It was an invitation to begin again, a chance to leave the past behind. The woman entered the courtyard expecting death. She left with something far more powerful: a second chance. 2,000 years later, the crowd is gone, but the lesson remains. That is why this story continues to resonate with people across generations, not because we lived in first-century Jerusalem, but because the human heart has not changed very much. People still rush to judgment. People still focus on the failures of others while minimizing their own. People still find it easier to condemn than to understand. The stones may look different today. Sometimes they take the form of harsh words, sometimes public humiliation, sometimes pride, sometimes self-righteousness, but the temptation remains the same. And that is exactly what Jesus confronted in the courtyard. Notice what makes his response so remarkable. He never denied the seriousness of sin, but neither did he ignore the need for mercy. He refused both extremes. That balance is what makes the story timeless, because everyone eventually finds themselves somewhere in this scene. Sometimes we are the crowd, quick to criticize. Sometimes we are the religious leaders, certain we are right. And sometimes we are the woman, aware of our failures and hoping for mercy. That is why the story still speaks so powerfully today. It is not simply about the people who stood in that courtyard. It is about us. The strongest person in the story was never the one holding a stone. It was the one willing to put it down. And that leaves every reader with the same question the crowd carried away that morning. Not, what should happen to her? But, what does this reveal about me?